Good afternoon. My name is Philip Munoz. I direct the Constitutional Studies program and the Tocqueville program. It's my pleasure to welcome you today. A special thank you to Professor Bodding and McKenna and the Office of Merit Scholars and all the scholars here for sharing your class time with us. I'm very pleased that we could partner with you this afternoon. We started the minor in Constitutional Studies about 5 or 6 years ago, and its aim is to introduce students to the philosophy, the politics of constitutional government, comparative constitutionalism, American constitutionalism, again, the philosophy, the political theory of constitutionalism, and then constitutional practice. And today's lecture fits right in there. How do you make our constitutional republic more inclusive in light of all of its challenges? If you're interested in the minor, please come talk to me. Jen Smith, who really runs the program, is in the back there, and we can provide you the information. We'd love to tell you more about the program. I also direct our Tocqueville Fellows program. The Tocqueville program focuses on religion and public life, and we have about a dozen Tocqueville Fellows. The Fellows help us plan events, they host our events, they meet with our speakers. Tomorrow they'll have breakfast with Professor Morel. If you're interested in the Tocqueville Fellowship program, you should talk to me as well after the talk. And one of the formal things our fellows do is they introduce our speakers. So I'm going to call Roger Karma to the podium. Roger is second year as a fellow, and is a senior, Constitutional Studies minor, is off to Washington, D.C. In the fall to start work there, and he'll introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Professor Munoz. Lucas Morel is a professor of politics and head of the Department of Politics at Washington Lee University, where he teaches and writes on American government, political theory, Abraham Lincoln, and Black American politics. Dr. Morel is the author of works such as Ralph Ellison and the Raft of Hope, A Political Companion to Invisible Man, and Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government. He is currently writing a book on Lincoln and the American founding. Outside of academia, which I think is also equally as interesting, Professor Morel has consulted on exhibits for the Library of Congress on Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, has conducted history workshops for high school teachers throughout the country, and has co-written lessons on antebellum, Civil War America, and the modern civil rights movement for the National Endowment of the Humanities. In today's lecture, Words Fitly Spoken, Lincoln and Ellison as Writers of Social Responsibility, Professor Morel will explore how Abraham Lincoln and Ralph Ellison, through their speeches and stories, challenged the American people to live up to their political principles. Please give me a hand in welcoming Professor Lucas Morel.
I don't think so.
Thank you, Roger, for your generous introduction, and thanks to my good friend, Professor Philip Munoz, and Eileen Bodding, who I haven't met yet, but I bet you would be a good friend too if I met you. So thank you for all the work that you do with the Constitutional Studies program, the University Merit Scholarship programs, and the Hesburgh USCO Scholars program for this invitation to speak on ethical leadership. Kind of bizarre that we have to actually add the word ethical to leadership. I don't know if that says something about us. Actually, I'm pretty sure it does say something about us, which is not good. So I'm glad that these programs are in place to explore this topic. Ethics in leadership focuses on how the character and principles of singular individuals motivate a group to achieve objectives. In a political community, that objective is the common good, which in a free society must gain the consent of the governed. I'd like to explore this act of persuasion, this inducement to civic cooperation that was, in my mind, the noble aim of two masters of the English language, Abraham Lincoln and Ralph Ellison. Frederick Douglass once said that the American people saw in Abraham Lincoln, quote, a full-length portrait of themselves. In him, they saw their better qualities represented, incarnated, and glorified, and as such, they loved him. Viewed this way, ethical leadership brings out the best in one's fellow citizens. Lincoln's words sought to ennoble the American people by calling forth their better selves. Ralph Ellison's fiction and social commentary, performed a similar function. In keeping with the title of his landmark novel, Invisible Man, Ellison believed his civic duty as an American writer was to help readers see each other better, more clearly, and thereby facilitate the trust that a free society requires to operate in the interest of all its members. I call Lincoln and Ellison writers of social responsibility because their speeches and stories, through these, they challenged Americans to have greater trust in their political principles, especially in times of crisis. In so doing, they reinforced the most secure basis of their freedom and understanding of what they possessed in common. As the Declaration puts it, the equal rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The ethics of their leadership can be found in their appeal to the American people to live up to what Lincoln called the better angels of their nature. Stole that from Shakespeare. Stole a lot from Shakespeare. Lincoln as a politician, Ellison as a writer, believed that they had a responsibility to call forth the best that Americans could muster as engaged citizens of a republic. They promoted the civic health of the nation by diagnosing its public ills and offering ways to help Americans better align their practice with their profession. In sum, the president and the novelist exercised social responsibility by trying to get a diverse people to see each other more clearly and especially to notice, as I mentioned, what they possessed in common. In doing so, they hoped that their fellow citizens would renew their faith, as Lincoln put it, that right makes might, and therefore to use government to protect the rights of all Americans. Lincoln and Ellison could therefore appeal to the formative principles of the regime as the means as well as the goals to keep the nation on its course, especially, as I mentioned, in times of crisis and instability. The crisis of Lincoln's era was the controversy over slavery, a controversy so rooted in race that it extended well beyond the Civil War and into Ellison's time as the modern civil rights movement gathered steam. Ellison once wrote, "Whenever we as Americans have faced serious crises, we have returned to fundamentals." Both men located the fundamentals of America's political faith in the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. For Ellison, writing ethically was more than writing, in his words, as if the governor of Mississippi was looking over his shoulder. In America, it took its bearings from what he called our sacred documents. He emphasized the fact that our founders, flawed as they were, put their principles on paper. They wrote it down so others, whether they liked it or not, could read it, judge it, weigh, and consider it for themselves to see if it had any claim on them. When asked about institutions that Black Americans could call their own, institutions to preserve what Blacks had contributed to the nation's development and therewith their own progress, Ellison answered, "We have the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and we have jazz." Ellison believed what he called the American covenant was not to be thrown away. For in the Declaration and the Constitution, American Blacks as well as whites possessed the only firm basis to what he said, to make a unity out of their diversity. There's a slogan in there. Some of you Latin people should get working on that. Ellison wrote that only by affirming the moral ideas of the country could a wavering people regain its political footing in a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That last part, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. For Lincoln, the lodestar of his political thought and action was the equality principle found in the Declaration of Independence, a principle he believed applied to both blacks and whites. He formulated a kind of political golden rule to express the fundamental implication of the Declaration's equality principle. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This was his definition of democracy. And he believed that whites needed to see that the security of their own rights was founded on something more fundamental than race. It was founded upon one's humanity, a humanity that encompassed the entire human race. The logic of the Declaration compelled this conclusion if the nation's first Emancipation Proclamation were to make any sense in their attempt to free themselves from British tyranny. Lincoln understood more deeply than any American since the founding that the stakes of America's political development centered on the belief that might does not dictate right. What exactly does that mean? In what way does this constitute the fundamental premise of our self-governing way of life? For Lincoln, matters of right and wrong were not the mere product of majority vote, but derived from moral standards that transcended nations and reached across time. Lincoln believed that the American founders declared their independence by appealing to these standards of right. So by the 1850s, when the question of slavery's future threatened to dissolve the American Union, Lincoln thought a return to the founders' approach to the issue could best resolve the controversy. You may have noticed that I've drawn the title of my lecture from Proverbs 25, verse 11, which states, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in pictures or frames of silver." This verse inspired Abraham Lincoln to jot a note to himself about the connection between the Declaration and the constitutional union of the American states. He did so after receiving a letter from Alexander Stephens, a former Whig ally, but soon to become Vice President of the Confederate States of America. After South Carolina seceded following Lincoln's election, Stephens wrote to Lincoln asking for a public statement to help calm fears in the southern slaveholding states. This is Stephens. "I would have you understand me as being not a personal enemy, but as one who would have you do what you can to save our common country." And he added, "A word fitly spoken by you now would indeed be like apples of gold in pictures of silver." Stephens himself had given a speech to his home state of Georgia, remarkably telling them not to secede. And so as the nation entered into the secession winter between Lincoln's election in November and his inauguration in March, Stephens thought the nation could use an urgent word from the president-elect. Lincoln disagreed. What the nation needed was not new words from the incoming president, but old words, words found at the founding. Even though he revered the Constitution and the Union, Lincoln understood them as means to a higher end, namely the protection of individual rights. And in this note to himself, he called this liberty to all. To forget that the constitutional union existed to secure this end was like forgetting that pictures or settings of silver were made to show off something even more valuable, those apples of gold. In his note to self, Lincoln described the principle of human equality as follows. He said, "The assertion of that principle at that time, 76, was the word fitly spoken, which has proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver, subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture." Lincoln thought that this old way of thinking about humanity, the equality of all men, would be a better way than any new way, whether proposed by him or anyone else. To lose sight of the goal of liberty to all would turn self-government into mere majority rule. And this would thereby allow numerical might to determine which individuals had any rights deserving of government's protection. If this were to happen, Lincoln once remarked, he would, quote, prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. By the time of the 1860 presidential election, he saw two ways of interpreting the Constitution that were undermining the spirit of '76. On the one hand, Southern slaveholders threatened to disrupt the American Union on behalf of a new way of thinking about the human race, rejecting human equality in favor of white supremacy. And they made that explicit in their Constitution. On the other hand, a less obvious, but therefore more insidious threat was the effort by Lincoln's Illinois rival, Stephen Douglas, an effort to apply what he called local popular sovereignty to the question of slavery in the federal territories. Agreeing with Chief Justice Roger Taney in the 1857 Dred Scott case, Douglas argued that Congress did not have authority over slavery in the territories. Therefore, Douglas believed that the national crisis over slavery could be lessened if the expansion of black slavery were removed from Congress's purview and left just for the local settlers to decide. What could be more American than that? Lincoln thought that Douglas's professed indifference regarding the expansion of slavery, a position that Lincoln referred to as the don't care policy, because it taught white Americans not to care about slavery as long as it was the enslavement of people that didn't look like them. He thought that this would actually produce the expansion, in fact, the nationalization of slavery. Douglas's version of popular sovereignty taught Americans that as long as white folks voted on the issue, majority rule could determine whether slavery should be expanded or not. And so the greatest threat to the viability of self-government in the 1850s was not Southern white slave owners. According to Lincoln, it was Northern white citizens. In other words, if they were to succumb to the temptation not to care about what happened to black people in the Western territories. The battle over slavery in those territories would be determined not simply in those territories, but also in free states, where presumably the battle over slavery was already won. Lincoln insisted that what happened to blacks in those territories was precisely an issue in which all Americans had a stake. He believed both constitutional principle and practice enabled Congress to determine the future of slavery in those territories, and therewith the future of slavery or freedom in the United States. So in the face of these defective alternatives, Lincoln concluded his private note with the charge, "Let us act that neither picture or apple shall ever be blurred or bruised or broken." By connecting the principle of human equality to the mechanisms of the American Union and the United States Constitution, Lincoln showed the necessity of a concept of right to ensure that the operation of political might would promote the common good and not just the self-interest of the many. In the end, to enjoy the exercise of what we all possess in common requires a certain measure of restraint. This is another aspect of ethical practice, to act within certain limits. And Lincoln was our greatest defender of acting within limits or restraint. He reminded us of our fundamental expression of that restraint, the U.S. Constitution. And this is why Lincoln approached emancipation in the way that he did. He had to turn a humanitarian end into a constitutional means in order to justify it, in order for it to be legitimate in the eyes of the American people. His distinction between personal wish and official duty was required, he believed, under government by consent of the governed. The government could do no more than the citizens had delegated to it. That said, he also noted that having a written constitution, while necessary for freedom, was not sufficient. That's why he rejected secession, for he saw in it a rejection of constitutionalism. Right ruling, in his mind, required right thinking as well. To operate under a constitution without a proper understanding of the principles that informed that constitution would lead, as I mentioned earlier, to the crude majoritarianism of Douglas's popular sovereignty, or, at worst, the nationalization of slavery envisioned by Alexander Stephens. In Lincoln's mind, this would be a picture or apple blurred or bruised. And if the nation were unable to recover a common understanding of why the American Union exists, the meaning of America, both picture and apple could be broken. So Lincoln's ethical leadership can be summed up best, I think, by this commitment, both to the institutions and practices of American self-government, as well as the ideals of the nation. And the recognition that this understanding needed to be handed down from generation to generation. This was his abiding concern as a politician and as an engaged citizen. What he called in his first great speech of 1838, the perpetuation of our political institutions. It was a theme he returned to most famously in his Gettysburg Address. 272 words that have yet to be surpassed in their description of the meaning of America, the Civil War, and the hope of self-government for all members of society. Now, I've mentioned that Ellison made frequent reference to what he called the sacred principles of the democratic faith and our sacred documents of state. He argued that these principles, which he understood as democracy, equality, individual freedom, and universal freedom, now move us as articles of faith and prod us ceaselessly toward the refinement and perfection of those formulations of policy. And he added that these principles interrogate us endlessly as to who and what we are. They demand that we keep the democratic faith. And so the gap between American profession and practice became an abiding theme for Ellison, as was his insistence that it had long been Black Americans who, regardless of their precarious position in American society, reminded majority white America of its highest ideals. In a 1976 Time magazine essay that he originally titled "The Fantasy of a Blackless America," Ellison declared, "Today it is the Black American who puts pressure upon the nation to live up to its ideals. It is he who insists that we purify the American language by demanding that there be a closer correlation between the meanings of words and reality, between our assertions and our actions. I am enlisted for the duration," Ellison noted, in what he called the Negro Freedom Movement. That was the locution he used at the time. But instead of enlisting as a Negro leader, Ellison saw his calling as a literary one, not principally as a political one. By pursuing excellence as an artist, if you will, this realm of human expression, Ellison thought he would be contributing to the freedom movement, precisely because he believed the American novel, quote, at its best, had always been concerned with this basic moral predicament. And that predicament was the contradiction between the noble ideals of the American founding and the actualities of our conduct. The best American novels, in his mind, never skirted that difference. Part of his responsibility as an artist, he expressed in the epilogue to Invisible Man. It meant affirming what he called the principle on which the country was built, namely, all men are created equal. Black Americans, in his mind, were duty-bound to preserve this principle. As he put it, because we were the heirs who must use the principle because no other fitted our needs. Invisible Man, the narrator, adds, not for the power or vindication, but because we, with the given circumstance of our origin, could only thus find transcendence. So Ellison asked, how does the Negro writer participate as a writer in the struggle for human freedom? To whom does he address his work? What values emerging from Negro experience? And by Negro, he meant the Black American experience. He thought that was a singular, unique experience. What values emerging from Negro experience does he try to affirm? Ellison emphasized that the struggle for freedom was a human endeavor, not principally a black or a racial one. This likens to Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach to the struggle for what he called citizenship rights. Recall that the organization, born of the late Rosa Parks' seminal bus protest in 1955, was not called the Negro Improvement Association. It was called the Montgomery Improvement Association. In fact, their first resolution called for, quote, every citizen of Montgomery, regardless of race, color, or creed, to refrain from riding buses. The call went out to every Montgomery citizen. To the extent that Ellison's writing reminded readers of their common humanity and the cost of that humanity as he understood it, he thought this increased consciousness could lead to a greater conscientiousness, his words, and hence a better society all around. Ellison believed his work as a writer, and especially his first novel, Invisible Man, actually served the civil rights movement by offering a literary representation of the possibilities and pitfalls of Black American leadership in post-World War II America. The novel anticipated the movement in its concern for the individual in the face of a society unwilling to see beyond what Ellison called the mystique of race. When Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of a world where his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, he shared with Ellison a concern for the dignity of the individual. Like King, Ellison saw the modern civil rights movement as a part of a broader human freedom movement. As he said of the Black American press, so too, I believe Ellison would say of the civil rights movement that its obligation is to the broader complexity of humanity, black, white, and everything in between. Ellison's writings address this theme of human freedom and diversity, a theme which had been the province of novelists from the beginning. And so, given his specific American context and his position as a black man in majority white America, Ellison thought that the story of Black Americans could not be told sufficiently as one simply of victimization. To be sure, blacks were targets, as he put it, targets of discrimination. They suffered injustice and oppression for the arbitrary characteristic of skin color and race. Nevertheless, what Ellison found intriguing about his own story and the story of Black Americans, he knew was their ability to make a life for themselves despite a racially prejudiced environment. And these are Ellison's words. Negro Americans had to learn to live under pressure. Otherwise, we'd have been wiped out. We were forced into segregation, but within that situation, we were able to live close to the larger society and to abstract from it enough combinations of values, including religion and hope and art, which allowed us to endure and impose our idea on what the world should be, of what man should be, and of what American society should be. With all the emphasis upon what whites have done to blacks in this country, Ellison thought one would never expect blacks to accomplish anything if it were true that all blacks did was simply react to white oppression. This was nowhere near the whole story, as he lived it and as he understood their history. Are American Negroes, he said, simply the creation of white men? Or have they at least helped to create themselves out of what they found around them? Ellison pointed to their resistance to provocation, their coolness under pressure, their sense of timing, their tenacious hold on the ideal of their ultimate freedom. These were, he thought, indispensable values in the struggle. And he thought that these were at least as characteristic of American blacks as the hatred, fear, and vindictiveness that writers like his good friend Richard Wright, among others, chose to emphasize. When Ellison heard about the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, the one that desegregated public schools, he wrote, "So now the court has found in our favor and recognized our human psychological complexity and citizenship, and another battle of the Civil War has been won. The rest is up to us, and I'm very glad. What a wonderful world of possibilities are unfolded for the children." In it, he saw the legal supports of racism giving way, allowing more access to our institutions. For him, the Brown case showed how black Americans, quote, turned the Supreme Court into the forum of liberty it was intended to be, and the Constitution of the United States into a briar patch in which the nimble people, willing people, have a chance. The next question was what black Americans would do with the freedoms they had secured for themselves in the law. As he put it in his posthumously published novel, Juneteenth, "You just be ready when the deal goes down. Have your people ready. Just be prepared." Ellison commented further that Southern blacks who have revealed themselves since 1954 are not products of some legal magic. They are the products of a culture that developed out of slavery and through their experiences since the Civil War and the first Reconstruction. This black American culture, what Ellison meant when he used the word Negro, Negro American, this, he thought, equipped them to demonstrate human excellences as quickly as the laws permitted. Ellison never tired of pointing out that it was not enough to speak of the ills visited upon blacks throughout American history. To do so was to reinforce pernicious stereotypes of what blacks were capable of. No, for Ellison, what was truly worth observing was what black Americans made of their predicament. Not segregation, not even slavery could keep, in his mind, the black man down. They could limit their freedom, but they could not stamp out their humanity. In particular, he believed that black Americans in his day, and for generations preceding him, were conditioned and disciplined by their specific group experience. And it was an experience that he thought had much to offer to the broader American society of which it was a part. Yes, the American experience of racial bigotry was unjust, degrading, hypocritical, in the extreme. But Ellison thought blacks possessed a humanity and therefore a will to struggle, survive, and create a life for themselves despite their limited circumstances. He said any people who could endure all that brutalization and keep together, who could undergo such dismemberment, resuscitate itself, and endure until it could take the initiative in achieving its own freedom, is obviously worth more than the sum of its brutalization. In the civil rights movement, especially the leadership of the Southern Black Church, America witnessed those attributes Ellison found worthy of preservation, albeit forged in the crucible of white American insecurity, hypocrisy, and violence. Ellison observed, Negro religion has been a counterbalance to much of the inequality and imposed chaos which has been the American Negro experience. When Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as an important American figure, it was an instance of the church making itself visible in the political and social life and fulfilling its role in the realm of morality. It is what they learned and became as a result of this experience that Ellison thought could speak to the nation to help it move to greater consistency with its ideals. And this is why he thought civil rights were only the beginning. No way was that the finish line. The struggle was not merely a matter of justice, that Black Americans received, say, the equal protection of the laws, but it was an effort to make room for the things they could contribute to the only land they could seriously call their home. For Ellison, the telltale sign that the struggle was bearing fruit was the inclusion, not the assimilation, of the Black man. You can ask me later why he made that distinction between inclusion and assimilation. In a 1961 interview, Ellison said, "Our Negro situation is changing rapidly, but so much we've gleaned through the harsh discipline of Negro American life is simply too precious to be lost. I speak of the faith, the patience, the humor, the sense of timing, the rugged sense of life, and the manner of expressing it, which all go to define the American Negro." Ellison believed that what was worth preserving in Black American life was not only a tribute to Black perseverance, but an intrinsic part of America's heritage, and as such, worth preserving for the benefit of all Americans. In fact, Ellison saw as his literary project the preservation and communication of these characteristics, these triumphs, these experiences of Black Americans, individually and as a people. Blacks were and are an intrinsic part of America's heritage, and hence not limited in his mind to playing a supporting role, a coerced one at that, in the drama that is American democracy. So for example, in his second novel, the unpublished one, that was produced under the title Juneteenth, Ellison explores the Black American festival surrounding the Juneteenth holiday and shows how, despite the horrors of Middle Passage, as he put it, the strongest came through. In a Juneteenth Day sermon, the lead character gives a brief history of how Blacks came to America, namely what America made of them and what they made of America. "Let those who will despise you, but remember deep down inside yourself that the life we have to lead is but a preparation for other things. It's a discipline through which we may see that which the others are too self-blinded to see." This minister also uses the sermon and the occasion of Juneteenth to teach the youth in particular the importance of knowing and telling their story. Learn to look at what you see and not what somebody tells you is true. Ellison received the National Book Award for Invisible Man in 1953, and he observed that his novel was an attempt, quote, to return to the mood of personal moral responsibility for democracy, what he believed typified the best of our 19th century fiction. He added playfully that the fact that he was receiving the award for what was his first novel indicated what he called a crisis in the American novel. He went on to explain that works by Mark Twain and others were, quote, imaginative projections of the conflicts within the human heart, which arose when the sacred principles of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights clashed with the practical exigencies of human greed, fear, hate, and love. He thought the American novel needed to be both broader and deeper, encompassing the nation's rich diversity and what he called its almost magical fluidity and freedom. He added that his narrative would need to confront the inequalities and brutalities of our society forthrightly, yet thrusting forth its images of hope, human fraternity, and individual self-realization. So in this literary way, ethical leadership becomes a form of truth-telling. Speaking truth to power perhaps is easier than speaking truth from a position of power. The best kind of truth-telling needs to be, in Ellison's mind, an expression of love. This was Invisible Man's plaintive cry at the heart of the novel. And could politics ever be an expression of love? Love is necessary for community to manifest itself out of the chaos of modern life. This meant not merely being honest about the country's failings, but also equipping one's readers to hear uncomfortable truths. In America, given what he considered her sacred documents, her ideals of equality and rights and consent, Ellison thought that this entailed the use of irony to deliver the lesson. Irony, he thought, especially in America, was best suited to highlight the gap between our professions, our principles on the one hand, and our practices on the other. He said, "We Negroes are the most ironic observers of the American scene." And a great short story that lays this out is one that he wrote around 1946 called In a Strange Country, which tells the story of an American merchant marine, much like Ellison himself, who lands in Wales and is rescued from being mobbed by white fellow servicemen by the Welsh foreigners. It's a short story. It's a very, very short story that ends with the national anthem being sung. This is Ellison in 46, forecasting decades ahead of time the Colin Kaepernick situation. Shifting back to Lincoln and truth-telling, Lincoln's second inaugural address, in my opinion, was his most sublime expression of truth-telling. One that he confessed was no more humbling to his listeners than to himself. About a week after delivering this message to the nation, he told a political operative that he expected his address, quote, to wear as well as, perhaps better than, anything I have produced. Remember, this came after the Gettysburg Address. But he quickly added, I believe it is not immediately popular. Why? He said, men are not flattered by being shown that there has been a difference of purpose between the Almighty and them. To deny it, however, in this case is to deny that there is a God governing the world. In telling this truth, that the Civil War might have been God's judgment on the entire country for the sin of American slavery, Lincoln hoped to unify the country upon the heels of its most divisive conflict. The extent to which this exhortation went unheeded is seen in the continued division posed by the American color line so many years later. To move from the sublime to the mundane, Ellison also used humor as a means of conveying what he called the tragic-comic aspects of life. He thought Black Americans in particular had learned to approach life this way because so much of what they faced that contradicted what the nation professed to believe compelled them to laugh, to keep from crying. This was a form of grace under pressure, a concept Ellison drew explicitly from Ernest Hemingway, even as he expressed disappointment with Hemingway for not applying this concept to the plight of blacks in Hemingway's day. It was a missed opportunity for one of the great writers in American history, and so Ellison took it upon himself to rectify that omission. A sort of scary story to read here is the first one that's in a collection of short stories called Flying Home and Other Stories. John Callahan, Ellison's literary executor, gave it a title. He calls it A Party Down at the Square. And it's the story of a lynching written by Ellison, told from the perspective of a white boy. So you see Ellison flipping Twain in that story. Tough read, but I think one that earns the effort. Ellison wrote to his good friend Albert Murray, a fellow Tuskegee student when he was there. He was trying to encourage him to keep writing and to forget what the critics were saying. He said, "You're writing for Negroes with enough integrity to accept themselves. And when you do that, white folks are bound to like it, just like they like jazz. Naturally, like any real work of art, jazz made a hell of a lot of white folks want to be," and he used the word Moes as a stand-in for a black person. He says, "A hell of a lot of white folks wanted to be like Moes, simply because jazz is art, and art is the essence of the human." Ellison employed the name Moes to mean black Americans, but he did so by turning the stereotype of Uncle Tom or Mose on its head, signifying how deft and skilled black people have been as they forged a life for themselves in the crucible of American race relations. He said, "All I had done really was to tell them to dig the world, each for himself." Integrity, this kind of integrity that Ellison was appealing to Albert Murray to stick to and to project in his own fiction. This integrity doesn't mean just acting consistent with some moral code. It meant acting on what Ellison referred to as your own sense of reality. As the vet in Invisible Man tells Invisible Man on the way to New York, "Play the game, play it your own way. Part of the time at least. Play the game, but raise the ante. Learn how it operates, learn how you operate." Teaching the reader to form and trust his own opinion regarding his lived experience in America is part of the lesson of Invisible Man. Ellison commented on what he thought was happening in the civil rights movement and the aftermath of the civil rights movement, especially with young black Americans. He said that they were plagued less by what he called the psychic domination of whites than by ignorance of themselves, of their history as Americans, and by an unwillingness to find the terms, the concepts, the images through which they and they alone can define their marvelous complexity. He said, "No one else can do it, for no one else has the perspective, won through exclusion, through which to do so." So here the irony of exclusion as the key, or at least a key, to a unique perspective on American life is simply missed by those who would view the oppression and adversity experienced by blacks as an absolute barrier to their engagement with the broader American society. Blacks knew full well, as whites should have known, that even in the most segregated city in America, that city offered those blacks an up-close, personal, and yes, behind-the-scenes look at the ways of white folk through the service blacks provided in white homes and businesses. They had a special perspective. Ellison said, "Black Americans know through their own experience the superficiality of the evidence upon which the myth of white superiority rests. They also know that they haven't lived all these years as servants to a race of gods." While Ellison lauded the virtues developed by black Americans in what I am calling the crucible of America's color line, he never touted the virtues of blackness per se. Ellison had little patience for those who thought the answer to white supremacy was black supremacy or black separatism. He considered this just another form of secession, what he called an old American illusion, precisely because it denied how integrated even the most segregated society was throughout American history. Martin Luther King Jr. believed in and worked toward the goal of an integrated society, black and white together, as a freedom song proclaimed. Ellison also believed that America had within itself the capacity to form one people from its diverse parts. He wrote of this capacity in Invisible Man. In the epilogue, famously, he says, "America is woven of many strands. I would recognize them and let it so remain. It's winner take nothing. That is the great truth of our country, or of any country. Ellison repeatedly argued that he did not believe that the Black American contribution was in any way due to their genes as Black people. He said it was their engagement, both deliberate and incidental, with the greater society around them. This is what produced what he called Negro American culture. He said, when we finally achieve the right of full participation in American life, what we make of it will depend upon our sense of cultural values, our creative use of freedom, not upon racial identification. In the end, Ellison thought that this secessionist or separatist mindset reflected actually a lack of faith, a lack of courage to embrace fully America's democratic ideals, especially when it involved applying those ideals to a people the majority deemed different or strange. As the Reverend Alonzo Hickman comments in Ellison's Juneteenth, just listen to him down there. He's making somebody mighty uncomfortable because he's got them caught between what they profess to believe and what they feel they can't do without. Repeat that 1,000 times today. The American color line produced a tussle between the nation's ideals and the white majority's insecurity. Unsurprised at this reaction, Ellison explained its internal logic. We seek psychic security from within our inherited divisions of the corporate American culture, while gazing out upon our fellows with a mixed attitude of fear, suspicion, and yearning. It's during times of crisis when doubt about our principles surfaces. It's when we're most tempted to cling to what is most familiar, what makes us feel secure. For Americans, the long history with the color line proved the greatest rub in our attempt to align our practices with our principles. And so it is during these times when we most need ethical leadership. So when Ellison considered the documents of the American founding sacred documents, and when he argued that they constituted the underlying motives of American literature, he believed that but for the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution coexisting with what we called the peculiar institution, but for that coexistence, there would be no Huckleberry Finn, no Moby Dick. The question Ellison would pose is, do the old sacred words still work within us? To the extent that these old sacred words give life to American literature, Ellison had hope for American society, which is perhaps why he did not play a more visible role in the civil rights movement. Unlike those today who think that the Constitution or the Declaration do not include, or did not include, blacks as originally written, Ellison believed these documents contained the levers by which blacks would secure their rights and full inclusion in the American mainstream. They were, after all, the clearest, most authoritative expressions of the standards and mechanisms by which our society would be judged as providing, or not, the full protection of rights and equality under the law. In his first inaugural address as president, Bill Clinton captured this idea when he said, "Our democracy must not be only the envy of the world, but the engine of our own renewal. There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America." You had your chance. No gold star for you. In this, Clinton was only channeling what King had said a quarter century earlier. All we ask of America is that you be true to what you said on paper. If Americans had said something else altogether, we would be having an entirely different conversation. And so, the importance of public opinion, and therefore the importance of those who shape it. In this, ethical leadership is key. Lincoln said, "In this and like communities, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Consequently, he who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces decisions. He makes statutes and decisions possible or impossible to be executed. With his Gettysburg and second inaugural addresses, Lincoln remains our most famous cultivator of political well-being, articulating the meaning of America at our most critical testing of our national faith. But I hope that I've shown how a novelist can play a similar role in nurturing a healthy citizenry. As the narrator in Invisible Man puts it, the way home we seek is that condition of man's being at home in the world, which is called love and which we call democracy. In the end, if the words of Abraham Lincoln and Ralph Ellison help us to become better citizens, they will have performed each a genuine public service. I call that ethical leadership. Thank you.
We have a tradition here at the program that we always invite Notre Dame undergraduate students to ask the first question, and then we'll open up to everyone after that. So any undergraduates with a question? And it's a large room. I'm going to ask you, Professor Morel, to repeat the question for the recording. So stand up and tell us who you are along with your question.
Hi, my name is Ellison, and I'm a junior here at Notre Dame. So you talk about Lincoln and Ellison as writers of social responsibility. But so I'm an English major, and a lot of what we talk about is the fact that a lot of writers, especially if you're a minority writer, whether you like it or not, whether it's your intention, you will be read as someone who is speaking for the population you represent, or you will be read as someone who has a social responsibility. So do you think that it's possible for a writer to kind of escape that social responsibility, whether they intend to or not, or can they truly just write an artistic piece of work?
That's a great question. Let me try to do the short version of it. The question is, what you've learned in some of your English classes is that whether you like it or not, if you're a person of color who's writing literature or some identified group that isn't part of the majority white mainstream, if I can paraphrase, it doesn't matter that you want to be a great artist. People are going to still say, oh, that's a Mexican lit, or that's transgender sculpture, or that's a female work of art. Great question. It's a question especially that black artists have wrestled with, not just privately, not just individually, but publicly. They've worked out and in fact had debates about this, most famously during the Harlem Renaissance. Can I just be an artist? And then, no, you have to have at least one foot in for the cause. You have to be a writer of protest. I think Ellison's answer, since we're talking about literature, although Lincoln wrote some pretty good words himself, Ellison's answer is, take the example of music, right? That little excerpt I used from the letter to Albert Murray, where he talked about a hell of a lot of white folks are wanting to get into jazz. Why did they want to get into jazz? Because they wanted to be like black people? No, they wanted to get into jazz because they heard something, experienced something that a human being who happened to look like me or him, they heard something, they said, wow, I dig Mozart and I dig Stephen Foster, but who is this cat, Louis Armstrong, right? Where does this sound, right? In other words, if you want to be that person, you have to work as hard and tussle with the greats of that tradition. So name your group, whatever that group is. If you are engaged in the craft in a way that you want to speak not just to people who look like you, as if this was the only thing I had to offer. Thank God, no, right? There's a lot more to me, trust me, than this, okay? If you want to speak not just to people in your group, but if you want to speak to your community, meaning your neighbors, your country, maybe even the world, maybe not just for this generation, but 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, at that point, right, you either had the goods or you didn't. Ellison's shorthand version of this was, and my people are from the Dominican Republic, so this is a good one for me. I grew up in Southern California, you could tell by my accent. He said, even homeboys have to do their homework. Even homeboys had to do their homework, which is to say, just because I'm a Dominican, that doesn't mean I can write like Junot Diaz. Diaz? How do you pronounce his name? Right? Even though we may have the same, at least a few more genes alike than you and I do, that doesn't mean I can convey what I have experienced in this world and what little truth I want to share with it simply because I happen to look like fill in the blank, right? So the short version is, it's not a matter of escaping. It's a matter of who your standards are. So, I mean, when Ellison wrote, I mean, that's why he's so shocked. Dang, you give me my award. This is just my first novel. If I get the National Book Award, okay, great for me, but what does that say about all the rest of the people who are writing at the time? Jimmy Baldwin writes Go Tell It on the Mountain the very next year. Does that get the National Book Award? No. Why not? Okay. Does that answer your question? Yes, in other words, shoot for greatness. This is Notre Dame, for crying out loud. Left wing. Heard from the right wing already. Surely you've got a question about Lincoln. I once gave a talk that was completely on Ralph Ellison, and it was completely on the posthumously published novel Juneteenth. But I was introduced as this guy who teaches Lincoln. Guess what all the questions were about? Lincoln.
Hello, my name is Raul Rodriguez, and I'm a graduate student also teaching a course in the PLS program. We will actually be reading a little bit of Lincoln in that class. But I was wondering what your opinion was on the sort of modern interpretations of Lincoln, because it seems on the left, many people look at Lincoln as not doing enough, that he was, in some ways, might have even been a racist. Then there's people on the right, or maybe even libertarians, that say he was sort of a tyrant. He was trying to perpetuate or to start this war with the South, and that he wasn't really a good man. Mm-hmm. In the way that I've read Lincoln, it seems that Frederick Douglass might be a good way of understanding him, understanding Lincoln in his oration to Abraham Lincoln after his death. He says that Lincoln was the white man's president. Yeah. That he was willing to execute and to protect what people thought as a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. But ultimately, looked from a sort of more comprehensive view, we realized that his task was to save the Union and then to save the country from the stain of slavery. So would Frederick Douglass be the right way to look at Lincoln in this day, or is there somebody else that we can look at to sort of adjudicate between these two different views of Lincoln?
I thought she had a long question. All right, here we go. Lincoln has haters on the left and the right. I love this. I did not know this when I stumbled into this as my front burner research area. I just dug Lincoln, so I kept digging. I didn't know that Lincoln would be always popular because nobody's meh on Lincoln. When I teach Lincoln, I never have anybody who's like, yeah, the Gettysburg Address is pretty good. Nobody ever says that, okay? And I teach in Virginia, so we get a lot of kids from Texas. My wife's from Texas. We get a lot of kids from the Southeast. So I get them all, okay? So Lincoln has haters on the left. The short version is they think Lincoln was a racist, that he was a reluctant emancipator. Lerone Bennett, who I believe just passed away recently, wrote a whole book, I think close to 600 words, basically making the argument that Lincoln was a racist. That what he did about emancipation had nothing to do about really caring for black people. He was compelled. He was forced into it. What took him so long? He could have done it at the stroke of a pen on March 4th, 1861. That's the left. The right-wing haters, particularly the libertarians, see Lincoln as the grandfather or the godfather of big government. Here's the guy who suspended the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, tried civilians in military courts, shut down presses, and used war as a way to amplify executive prerogative. And therefore, he was the godfather of Woodrow Wilson, who was the godfather of FDR, and now this is why we have the bureaucratic administrative state. End of story. So those are the haters, left and right. Perhaps, still working on your question, am I good? Perhaps the best way to look at Lincoln is not by listening to these haters who may only have a part of the elephant, but by looking at one of Lincoln's contemporaries. In fact, one of Lincoln's greatest rivals in oratory. I mean, you think Lincoln quoted Shakespeare. Try reading Douglas. He quotes Shakespeare left and right. Douglas delivered this speech in April of 1876 upon the dedication of a statue of Lincoln, which nobody knows exists because it's 10 blocks behind the Supreme Court if you ever get to D.C. It's a dog park. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Dogs are cool. If it was a cat park, I'd mean that in a bad way. But anyway, it's a dog park. It has this statue of Lincoln with his hand. You know, it looks like he's blessing or giving a benediction over a crouching slave who's about to jump up. Douglas didn't care for the statue. He wanted this slave to be standing up, or the freedman to be standing up. He gives this oration, which is a remarkable oration because what he does is he never shakes the fact for the reader that he's an abolitionist. And if you're an abolitionist, anything Lincoln did was too slow, too tardy, too cold, too indifferent. And yes, I just quoted Frederick Douglass. Okay. But what he does remarkably in this speech is he walks you through what he himself was witnessing and experiencing and judging and discerning Lincoln was doing in the Civil War, time after time after time, things he thought were wrong. And then as the speech progresses, it's as if Douglas himself changes his mind gradually and begins to use this word that we use oh so rarely today, statesman, statesmanship. And so early in the speech, he says Lincoln was the white man's president. But that transmogrifies later into the speech as being, in his mind, the key to Lincoln's statesmanship. He said, had Lincoln put the emancipation of slaves ahead of preserving the Union, neither would have been achieved. Lincoln was bound as a statesman to consult, quoting Douglas here, bound as a statesman to consult what? Public opinion. Right? You could only do so much, even as an elected official, without public opinion. You got to bring the people along with you. Okay? And so Douglas comes to the conclusion in his own speech that, viewed from the genuine abolition ground, right? Lincoln seemed dull, tardy, cold, and indifferent. But viewed from the perspective of a statesman, he was, what does he say? Swift, zealous, radical, and determined. In other words, Douglas, the abolitionist, came to acknowledge, and people hate doing this in public, he came to acknowledge he was mistaken. That Douglas did not fully appreciate the task that statesmen have to perform when they lead a diverse people through difficult times. And he recognized Lincoln's greatness, almost as if, with each line, with each paragraph, with each section of this speech, you see the maturity of Douglas's own thought. And one, I believe, he's trying to carry along the nation with him. In the end, in that speech, what Douglas is trying to do is not allow Lincoln simply to be the black man's president. What year did he deliver that speech? April 1876. What's happening in the country in 1876? I'll tell you what's not happening. Black people are not being protected in the South. All the former Confederate states are now, borrowed this from Christianity, this kills me, redeemed. That fall election will produce the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, which will remove from the Southern neo-Confederate perspective what? Bayonet rule. In other words, the armies are now going to leave. And the blacks in the South are now at the mercy of their former oppressors. Just 10 years or so after the end of the Civil War. Douglas has a dead man, a dead white man, the martyred president, Lincoln, who he does not want simply to be viewed by white Americans in 1876 as the black man's president. Because after all, what did the black man's president already do? He freed the slaves. Our work here is done. Frederick Douglass said no to that. Lincoln has to remain not just the black man's president. He has to be the white man's president as well. And if that is the case, if Douglass is successful in convincing whites that Lincoln is their man too, then maybe black Americans will have some help down the road. That's one way to answer your question. The shortest way to answer your question is read Lincoln, for crying out loud. Read Lincoln himself. You're not even the great Frederick Douglass. I mean, just read Lincoln yourself.
That is probably the best analysis of Douglass's speech I've ever heard.
I should teach this stuff.
Yeah. We're almost out of time, but can we get one or two more questions? Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm also a PhD student. I study political theory. Thanks so much for coming. It's great to hear.
Appreciate the invite.
Sorry?
Appreciate the invite.
Oh, not me, but it's great to hear about scholarship on Ellison because I think it's neglected. And so I'm interested particularly about what you said about him as an artist and the problem of being an artist in a democratic society, which he takes up, I think, in his essay, The Little Man at
Chehaw Station, yeah. That's where you got off to go to Tuskegee University.
Yeah, right. And so that essay is subtitled The American Artist and His Audience. And so the way you framed your presentation was sort of the virtues of the leader, the statesman, and the artist. But Ellison seemed to say that hinges also on the existence of what he calls the little man behind the stove, the audience, the people listening, the people that the leader is trying to morph in some way. And so I'm wondering, do you still think the little man behind the stove exists in America today, or do you think he's been eroded by sort of the base democratic ethos that I don't know, it's threatening a lot of stuff in America today? That makes sense to you?
The latter part, I don't. What has eroded in the United States?
Democracy has sort of a homogenizing or lowering of standards or erosion.
Yeah, okay, how to restate this question? You guys, come on! The tough part should be the answer, not the question. Ellison wrote this essay, The Little Man at Chehaw Station, which describes a character who would be easy to overlook. He's behind a stove. And what Ellison means by that is that there are people, probably in this very room, that I have to assume have read Lincoln themselves. Ellison themselves, right? That know the tradition, that know the work, that the presumption of the leader that he has all the answers and therefore just says open wide and let me pour in. He says, Ellison says, that is a foolhardy task, especially in the United States, precisely because in the United States things are so fluid. Case in point, Ellison's own mother. For a living, she was a maid. So what we would consider, right, blue collar, menial work, right? Ellison himself went to segregated schools his entire life. Graduated from Frederick Douglass High School in Oklahoma. So you would see this picture of this woman, and in your mind you would say, not very literate, not very cultured, hasn't amounted to much, gets paid a measly wage, doesn't have much of an education. You would size her up like that. But what Ellison says, in America, even the maids pay attention. And what did his mother do? When her employer threw out the newspapers and magazines, etc., which were some nice newspapers and magazines, including Esquire magazine, for some strange reason he mentions that one. Where did those go? Straight to Ellison's house. In other words, even in a society where there are haves and not have a whole lot, there is a way in which the broader society has a way of shaping, or the potential of shaping the souls of those who aren't producing that. He has this wonderful story where he's collecting stories for the work, writers, what is that, WPA, something Projects Administration, it's under FDR. Ellison's basically going around collecting stories from people. And he chances upon these 4 guys. I think they're shoveling coal in some building. And he's hearing them talk about opera like they're aficionados. And he says, I'm sorry, I just gotta say, where the hell did you learn all this? Right? These guys didn't go to Juilliard or whatever the hotshot music place was at that time. And they said, fool, we're the best spear holders you've ever seen. In other words, they were hired extras at the Met. Do you want to volunteer for that job? I got a costume for you. Okay? So what happened? Probably the first, third, 10th aria they listened to, it was all new to them. But 4, 6, 8 seasons of that? Talk about a finishing school for learning from the best that opera has to offer, and they didn't own a single record. That's the little man at Chehaw Station. Ellison says you got to assume that you got to be DiMaggio. Was it DiMaggio or Musial who they said always played as if there was a kid out there who had never seen him at his best? Was it Musial? He didn't want to let that kid down. This might be the only time this kid sees me bat. The great DiMaggio, the great Musial, the great Babe Ruth. And so those are the standards. So have the standards been debased? I got one answer for you. Internet. Think about it. Is there a lot of crud on the internet? That's a question that answers itself. But oh my goodness, at your fingertips. You don't even have to have a computer. You have this thing called a phone that most kids don't know. You can actually use it to call people. This phone is like a personal copy machine, but it has got all the crud, but all the answers are there. I mean, there is so much accessibility available to people now that has nothing to do with whether you have an advanced degree or not. So I think there's the possibility of little men hiding behind the stove at Chehaw Station. I think it has exploded exponentially. I think Ellison his mind would be exploding right now, saying, wow. Wow. And what he called the interaction between the speaker, or the writer in his case, and the audience, he called it an antagonistic cooperation. An antagonistic cooperation in that essay. And by that he meant that the reader, most of them were probably not experts, but they were free to judge, free to discern, free to try to make sense of what the writer or the speaker was trying to say, and allowing for some pushback. And you see that call and response in Juneteenth, the posthumously published novel, and you see it in Invisible Man. You pitch them, we catch them, right? And then that was a strike. It's a call and response, a very typical way of sermonizing in some Southern black churches. Ellison took that trope from the Black American experience. Notice that. He took that trope and transposed it upon the world of literature and says, this is how the novel works. I'll close with this. Ellison, a number of things frustrated Ellison in writing Invisible Man. Number one, he's writing a novel. That's impossible, but he attempted it anyway. What frustrated him is he wanted to show the incredible complexity of the so-called Black American experience. And if you know anything from Invisible Man, I mean, the cast of characters is just nuts, right? Just the black characters, forget the white guys. The black ones are just like, they're all over the map, right? The problem, Ellison says, how do I communicate for some of these characters who themselves would communicate in a way that the typical white person, even the typical white literate person, would not be able to understand? So you get Ross the Exhorter, Ross the Destroyer. You get that character, right? He has a West Indian accent, and Ellison had to laugh out loud writing that dialogue, because they're hysterical, right? There's this one part where he wants to say that that's not logical, and what word does he use instead? It's not mathematics. I laugh out loud every time I see that one. My students are like, why are you laughing at that? Because it's like, math! He's an immigrant. He doesn't know the word that he's grasping for is logical, so the first thing he thinks of is mathematical. It's not mathematics, right? So Ellison's like, I want to write in dialect for where that's appropriate, but I want to reach people who don't know that dialect. And so the question becomes, will that person take the invitation? Okay, this is really my last story. At Tuskegee, Ellison was there on a music scholarship. He wanted to become a composer. But nobody told him it was off limits to go to the library. So even though nothing was assigned in the library, he went into the library anyway and discovered that there were books there. Books in English. And he said, I've heard of this guy called T.S. Eliot. And he wrote a story. No, strike that. He wrote a poem called The Wasteland. And this crazy thing, the English is crazy, but it has footnotes. How many poems have footnotes? And secondly, some of the footnotes are in Greek. What is Eliot doing with that? He's like, you want to find out? Right? There's gold in the earth, but you got to dig for it. So Ellison basically learned, I think, he learned a number of things from Eliot. But one thing he learned from Eliot was like, all right, if this guy can footnote a crazy poem in Greek, it's not even in English for crying out loud. If he can get away with that, and what did Ellison have to do? He had to go find someone who would translate the stuff because he didn't know Greek. If that poem rose to the level of art to such a degree that people actually made the effort to look up the Greek footnotes, maybe if I produce something that technical, that sophisticated, that profound, they'll do their homework, they'll do the legwork to try to figure out what it is that I'm trying to put down in terms of the American experience.
Please join
Thanks.
me in thanking Professor Morel.